Hello and welcome back to this AWS course. We're currently in section 4 and this is lesson 11, and in this lesson we're going to look at implementing a CloudFront CDN cache in front of our S3 bucket, which contains all of our image files, and this will result in much higher performance and also lower AWS costs. So I'd like to show you a sort of before and after a diagram that I've put together here. So this is the state of play as of the last lesson on the top half, and then the bottom half shows what we're going to do and how things will look after the end of this lesson. So I'm going to spend a bit of time just looking at the before scenario first so we sort of understand what's going on. So at the moment, the user interface is going off to the API server and running in the Lambda and saying, I would like a list of all the photos in the bucket. So the Lambda makes requests to the SDK. First of all, it asks for a list of all the files, and then it iterates through the list and it asks for a pre-signed URL for each file, and it returns all of those pre-signed URLs to the user interface, which then iterates through the list and makes an individual S3 URL request for each file and pulls each file directly from the S3 bucket. Now we can actually watch this network traffic and it's quite illuminating, so let's just go to our website. I'll bring up the developer tools network tab, and then I will just refresh this page and we'll see quite clearly what happens. The first thing that happens is it goes off to our web server and actually loads the web page, which consists of some HTML, JavaScript and CSS. And once the web page is loaded, it then finds this API call to the Photos API server, which is obviously to that Lambda sitting behind API gateway. So it makes this call to the API server, and the API server does just what we talked before, and it sends back the list of files, and we can see that list here. If we look at the response, we can see here's the photo data array that's being returned, and there's one JavaScript object for each photo, and we can see there's a small and large property, and here is a pre-signed URL address with S3 in the middle of it. So clearly this is a request to an S3 bucket. And then, forgetting health for the moment, it then goes off and actually makes a request for each file individually. So if we click on the first file request, here we can see that request to S3 for the first image. And if we look at the response, it gets the image data back and displays it. So that's what's going on currently after lesson 10. So let me go back to our diagram. Once we've completed this lesson, we'll have deployed a CloudFront cache in front of this bucket that contains the images. And the way the API server will now work is it'll receive the same request, and again it'll go off to the SDK and get a list of files, but this time instead of returning a whole bunch of S3 requests, it'll return requests to the CloudFront cache instead. And we'll see that these addresses to this CloudFront website are very easy to construct. All they are is the address of the CloudFront website followed by the file key. So we'll come back to that a little bit later in the lesson. So that's the theory. Now let's go and start looking at the source code. If you'd like to follow along with the source code, if you visit richardbraycourses.co.uk, you'll see that each section has its own GitHub repo. So this is section 4. You can just click on this repo link here and you'll be taken to this repo, and you can see the source code for the last lesson, lesson 10 in this folder, and the source code for this lesson, lesson 11 in this folder. So we're actually going to look at Visual Studio with this entire repo open. So let's just go there. And as you can see here, I've got AWS 04 full stack, and it's got all of the folders. So to start with, I'm just looking at lesson 10. This is the last lesson, and the API server code that we've just been referring to. So here is the endpoint we can see it gets a list of all the objects, and then it iterates over the list and generates a pre-signed URL to the bucket and sends them all back. So let's compare that with the new code. So I'll go to services, source, app.ts. I'll put this on the other side. And if we scroll down to the new code for the photos bucket, we can see that here it's not only reading the bucket name, but now it's getting hold of the CloudFront URL as well. This is the address of that CloudFront CDN cache, and checks them. And then it gets the client name, and then it starts off as before. It goes and gets a list of objects, just like this, getting a list of objects here. It initializes a photo data array, just as it did before. It iterates through all the files, just like it did before. But the difference is that now it puts together a URL based on the CloudFront URL, followed by an encoding of the key of the file name with a slash between them. This encoding just encodes special characters like question marks and colons. Essentially is the CloudFront website address followed by a slash followed by the file name. And then we return the data just like we returned it before. It's the same data format being returned, but it's a reference to the cache rather than the S3 bucket. So that's the code. So what I'd like to do now is I'll bring up a terminal in this monorepo. This is the lesson 10 monorepo, and I will destroy everything that's been created so far. So I'll just say prun destroy everything, which will essentially just delete my two stacks, my two CloudFormation stacks. So this will go ahead and take everything down, and when that's complete, I'll then come into lesson 11 and I will build these stacks. The reason I can't upgrade them is because I've done a lot of renaming, and essentially I've completely refreshed everything in lesson 11. So I'll just put this on pause temporarily. I'll come back to you when this is destroyed, and we'll look at building lesson 11's stacks. Okay, lovely. So that's all been destroyed cleanly. So let's just pop up Chrome. And if we look at the CloudFormation page now, just refresh it, you'll see there's only the CDK toolkit left. This is the Bootstrap stack. And now this website doesn't exist anymore, so I might as well just delete this page. And let's go back and create the new stacks from lesson 11. So all I need to do is open a terminal, do pnpm install, and then prun deploy everything. And that'll build all the infrastructure for lesson 11. So I'll come back to you in a moment when this is finished. Okay, that's now completed. And I've got just one other job to do. Let's just go and upload these photos here, these 9 photos, into the bucket. So I can do that using this bulk image upload script. So I'll just say prun bulk image upload. And this will take those 9 photos and put them into the newly created S3 bucket. There we go. Bucket now contains 9 photos, so we can put that back. Okay, and now we should be in good shape to go and visit the new website. So I'll go off to the CloudFront website URL. And just as before, here are the images. And let's open that network tab again and refresh the page. And we can see, again, we go off and visit the website to load the HTML, JavaScript and CSS. We then make a call to the Photos API requesting all of the images, and we this time, if we look at our response, it looks quite different. We're now not got pre-signed URLs coming back, but instead we've got the CloudFront address followed by the key of the image, just as we saw in the code. And then we can see this request being made. If we look at the first image, 0423, that's over here. So let's go and look at that request, and we can see here it is. visiting the CloudFront CDN website, specifying the key of the file it wants. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to the change in the way the stacks are structured. So I've actually got another Excalibur diagram, and you can see I've taken the original diagram and I've added to it this on the left hand side. So here I'm just showing that in order to load this website from a browser, the browser visits an Amazon CloudFront website, which in turn is getting the website data from a bucket, and we've been publishing that data. So we've had two buckets. We've had one bucket related to the website and this other bucket which is related to the API server. So if I show you the stacks that we've been using up until now, up here, this is how the code's actually been structured. Let me just go back into view mode and move this around a little bit so you can see it all. Okay, so up until lesson 10, we had two stacks. One stack was for the website, which had a website bucket and this CloudFront presence. And then the other stack was the API server stack, and that was actually creating this photos bucket and the API gateway. Well, I've changed the entire structure now, and instead what we now have is I've left this in place, but over here I've now got two stacks. I've got one stack to contain the API server, the Lambda, and the API gateway in front of it. And I've got a completely new stack which contains the images bucket and the CloudFront cache in front of it. So we'll now go and have a look at the source code inside these three stacks. So let's just close this and close the terminal, close that. In fact, we can close lesson 10 entirely. And over here, we'll come to the CDK source code. So to start with, let's just compare the website stack and the images stack, because we'll see they're remarkably similar. Both of them create a bucket. Now the website bucket basically blocks all public access because the bucket itself, if we go back over here, this bucket over here is completely hidden from view. The user will simply run a browser and that will go to the CloudFront website, and behind it is this hidden bucket. We're publishing into it, but we're the only people that ever get to look at this bucket, and we've got administrator privileges. So the website bucket is completely blocked, whereas the images bucket, this currently allows a put command. That's because when the user wants to upload a new photo, they will talk directly to the bucket still and use a pre-signed URL. But when they now want to look at all the images, they won't go to this bucket anymore. Instead, they will use the CloudFront distribution. So here are our two CloudFront distributions. And again, this one here, the website, has these error codes because if the user accidentally tries to access the wrong page, whereas this distribution doesn't need anything like that because all the connections to this images bucket for reading purposes are just being done programmatically through the API. And we also, and finally, we saved some parameters which just enable other stacks and applications to locate where the buckets and CloudFront distributions are. So that's to CloudFront distributions, and then finally the API stack. So looking at the code for the API server stack, let's just go and put next to it the API server code. So we saw in the API server at the top of this photos endpoint we've just been looking at, it required two pieces of information from the environment, both the bucket name and the CloudFront URL. It needed the bucket name so it could get a list of all the files in the bucket, and it needed the CloudFront URL because it wanted to build the URL for accessing the files from it. So both of these pieces of information needed to be poked into the environment of our API server. Accessing both of these things via SSM parameters, the images bucket name and the images CloudFront URL. And if we just go back to the images stack, we can see that both of these were actually being stored by the stack. There's the bucket name and there's the distribution URL. So back to the API stack, the bucket name and the distribution URL are here. They're read in, and then pretty much everything else proceeds exactly as it did before. Remember that we need to grant permissions so that this bucket can be accessed by the Lambda. So this time we use this call bucket from bucket name to get hold of the bucket, and then we set the permissions over here. Before we were actually creating the bucket, but now we're simply accessing it via its name. But the remainder of the function is exactly as it was before. So they're the main changes. So finally, well, let's just go off and look in CloudFormation again, and we can see now that we have these three stacks. And with that, I will draw the lesson to a close, and I will see you in the next.